and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Wang Lemang in Beijing. China's two-child policy finally came into effect on January 1st, allowing families to more easily expand their numbers. But will this new policy upset the existing family structures that have been built over previous decades? And why aren't more families rushing to take advantage of the new policy? How dire is China's demographic crisis, and will this new adjustments be enough? To discuss all that and more, I'm joined in the studio by Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics, and also Han Hua, a media and communications consultant. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
China's universal two-child policy comes at a time when the country is facing a looming demographic crisis. Now, about 16 out of every 100 Chinese residents are over the age of 60. That number may even increase in the coming 3 decades to 40 out of every 100. That's about 500 million people out of China's total population. Meanwhile, China's working-age population, which is defined as people aged between 16 and 60, fell by a record 4.87 million to 911 million in 2015, the 4th consecutive year of decline. The disappearance of demographic dividends will have a negative impact on China's economic growth. But now, with families in China being able to have 2 children, the demographic structure is expected to shift. And, on a larger scale, China's economic growth will also benefit from the potential baby boom. Experts predict that the two-child policy will fuel the Chinese economy, contributing 0.2% to GDP growth in 2016. In the long term, that population growth could boost GDP an average of 1.72% until the year 2075. But all of this depends on couples actually having that second child. Since China adopted a selective two-child policy, the country's newborn population dropped 320,000 from 2014 to 16.55 million last year, instead of an expected rise. Many couples are reluctant to increase the size of their families due to the growing cost of education and health care. Some observers also believe that 3 decades of living with the policy of one couple, one child has already changed people's attitudes towards family structure. Whether a baby boom will really prove to be the boost China's economy needs still remains to be seen.
So now let's talk about China's second child policy with our studio guests here, Ms. Han Hua and Professor Liu Baocheng. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thanks.
So China's one-child policy is no more. We've seen this this gradual relaxation process all the way since 2014, and now it is replaced by a second child policy. But before we even start discussing the kind of effectiveness that this new policy could bring, let's talk about this question: whether or not this new policy could encourage parents to have a second child.
I think it will, in the foreseeable future, I would say, with the new additional favorable policies to be added towards the second child policy, like the encouragement, the right promotion and the publicity, as well as some subsidy, maybe some subsidy from the local governments. Maybe people will be more encouraged to have their second child, but currently people are still in their maybe waiting and seeing period to see how the policy will go and how they will calculate how it will affect the family structure as well as the cost, both tangible and intangible cost. It will affect a family structure.
Well, this new major policy shift came amid China's new reality: an aging population, an aging workforce, and a low fertility rate. So, Professor Liu, what are your thoughts on this new policy? Could it eventually bring the targeted results?
Well, human production are in 3 dimensions: people, reproduction, material creation, and spiritual creation. So it's a natural right to maintain the reproductive rate for the viability of any race. But the issue is that I see an alienation in the human behavior, that they use too much economic calculation to deal with a natural right. And now I think the policy intention is still focused on a very short-sighted utilitarian approach. Oh, we need more workforce. We need to balance the gender. But I think now it is really to return the basic human rights and basic human instinct. And no country in the world, over 200, have had this such a policy, and they never run into disaster simply because of the size of the population, because people will have a natural way to correct themselves and to be more adaptive to the habitual environment. So therefore, I think now with the urbanization process and also with better education, with better entertainment, and people now are having a more rational plan, and so therefore they do not really have the inclination to go to that natural right.
But it seems that for many people, this rights that's being given back to them is kind of hard to digest. As you mentioned, a lot of parents are waiting to see whether or not they're going to have the second child. So why is that? Why are they having second thoughts?
I think things have changed so drastically over the past 30 years. It is true that the one-child policy is a policy with Chinese characteristics, and we can see it produced very positive results in terms of the economic development for the past 30 years. But it also created many side effects with regard to the traditional culture shaking, as well as, the social structures not that stable. We are already we're still a developing economy, but in terms of the population, in terms of the age of the population, we're already in a developed status. So I think the government is determined to change that status, to make the population more vivid, more creative, because we are also promoting this creative industry in our next economic transfer. So this is the background of we proposed the one-child policy in the past, in the 30 years ago, but now we're proposing the second-child policy. I would predict that in the future, there may be more loosening up towards this policy, like Professor Liu just mentioned that. It's the human rights. Mm-hmm. The government is doing the right thing to give the rights, the birth rights, the raising child rights back to its people. So it's a good intention and it's a good trend, but how to manage this, how to manage people's expectations with regard to raise the one more child in the family, I think it needs both the joint efforts, both from the family members themselves as well as the society, the governments.
Now, the impact of this second child policy could work on family level as well as the social level. So on the family level, Professor Liu, what are your views on this new policy and how could it change family structures in China?
Yeah, family composition will definitely be altered with the addition of siblings. Number one, the siblings have sort of a rivalry position, because they are all fighting for the
attention.
What we call it, family has the triple E resource, emotional resource, educational resource, and economic resource. So there's the hypothesize, particularly the firstborns, are really feeling sort of envious and a sort of anxiety over the coming rivals. As a matter of fact, it also creates a sort of anxiety among the parents because they need to create more resources. So I could see that this is really not very true, simply because it's a hypothetical. Number one is that resources can be created when parents have more motivation to earn more money, and also they can really better arrange the time to have more shared time among more kids. And also the kids, they fight, but they are like kittens fighting in the fighting in the bedroom, so they are not really there to hurt. But actually, this type of fighting can really train their skills.
So it seems that providing all these resources, as you mentioned, all comes down to the parents. They really shoulder the bulk of the burden. And that's why a lot of them are having second thoughts, thinking that maybe I should wait and see, maybe the financial burden is too much that I cannot afford. And sometimes it's more just about money.
Well, look at how many pets are running around in the cities. So which means the parents also need some life around them, to communicate them, to express people's compassion over something that is alive, that is more interactive. So I think it's really a sort of filling the hole with more pets. And we also see many low-income families, simply because of the birth control, they are raising more pets. And so therefore, I think now with the loosening of such a policy, we really fill the gap. So I think now more, it's kind of interesting that the additional siblings will really fight a more rival with the pets than their firstborns.
Professor Liu, as you mentioned, pets are running out on the streets, and then there's this rival relationship between pets and children. But a lot of parents who are not going to have children, but who at the same time keep pets, would say that you don't need to educate your pets. I mean, it's a lot easier to have a pet than raise a children, paying for the education, being responsible for his or her whole life.
Well, it's a family inventory. It's a matter of investment. So I think it's more sure than to invest in the Shanghai Stock Exchange, because number one is that a human resource is not only a societal one but also a familial one, and particularly when the study has shown that hardship can really bring siblings together even tighter. And actually, the recent psychologist, Stanley Hall, she said, being only one child is a disease by itself, because you do not really learn how to solve problems. You do not learn how to really build the mediation skills with peers. So you go to the adults right away. So this type of environment can really create huge problem for family management and for community management. So therefore, the firstborns are considered to be superstars in China, emperors and empresses. So the level of spoilage can mean a very bad or even toxic return on investment for the family. So I think now with the more sibling effect that is lying there, so actually families can be really relieved of all the future worries. Of course, if we have better, social welfare program, both in terms of maternity leave and also child care, but most important is the improvement of medical care and also schooling, because these are something that really are impeding on the decision of those young parents to have more.
Well, you mentioned that parents, the government thinks they're doing parents a favor to give back their reproductive rights. But at the same time, it seems that parents do not necessarily appreciate this change. Parents reacted very differently to this new policy change. Many were racing against time to try to get pregnant, while others were like, 2 kids, thank you, but no.
Yeah, I think it's really the law of inertia at play. In 1979, when we introduced this policy, the government spent huge amount of efforts and resources to deter the incentive to have more children. And I visibly see that they carry pregnant women onto those tractors and have forced abortion, and huge amount of resources and a huge amount of the causes for social instability was introduced. But right now, after almost 3 decades, people are put or are rather tamed or domesticated in such a sort of situation, and people need to see what is really lying ahead. So it's just suddenly you open a window and people feel dizzy. They do not know which direction they should move in. Just in case then they may fall, onto the floor. But I think eventually people, if they really do see the benefit, they do see a certainty in the family planning ahead. It's not really control, it's really planning. So I think they will make a favorable decision.
This exactly shows how government and what government should do, towards the real encouragement. Like you said, the young parents may not appreciate this policy immediately or just appreciate it verbally. But at the end of the day, when they count and when they calculate the investment or the portfolio in one family, and they think everything will be more certain with regard to the schooling, with regard to the parenting and the medical care, child care, or even when they enter into an aged population, how they would be taken care by the society. When they calculate this too well, they think this might be a good choice, a better choice, and then they will just appreciate, they were given back the birth rights to themselves. And the policy comes into at the period of the world, the trend is in a declining, population, declining stage of giving birth to more children in one family. Even in the Western countries, like in Europe or in America, families tend to have less children compared to the last and the previous generations. So this is the world trend. I think China needs to do is to figure out, how we calculate our own formula right and well to maintain our economy, to maintain our country still, to be a vigorous, a more creative nation by the creation of the new generation, new population.
Well, whether or not to have a second child is a personal choice, but many would argue that it's important to at least have this option.
Yes.
Well, now let's take a short break. You're watching Dialogue. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Dialogue. Now let's keep talking about the social and family impact of the second child policy. Well, earlier in the show we mentioned that families do feel the burden, not only financial burdens, but also in terms of energy and time. And a lot of parents are trying to find excuses, citing environmental concerns. So in the long term though, Ms. Han, you are a mother. How would you evaluate the benefits that having a child, raising a child, and being a parent could bring to your life?
Like I said just now, parenting is a challenge. Parenting is also a very steep learning curve for me, from my personal experience. So it's not only a family extension to the next generation, but also being a parent, you can open a world to something new that you will never experience if you are not a parent. No offense at all. So my personal experience was raising the difference between raising one child or thinking of whether to have one more child in my family. And the past experience shows that even there is no peer pressure from the family in itself, we can always create for the child to teach the child the real value, not to be very selfish through the co-raising measure, such as you always create or have the child to have more peers, more friends from the school, from the society, from the neighborhood. Then I think the children, the value education in one family will not be missing at all.
Well, you talked about the benefits that having a second child could bring, and then we are seeing a lot of resistance, a lot of reluctance, and particularly people who were born before the one-child policy was introduced back in the 1970s. They couldn't understand why there's so much resistance.
Well, for the firstborns, they always think their monopoly is always good. It's like the market player, and now there is someone who is going to divide. But I think now when they really get rationalized, they will see that they are going to be shared. They are not going to be divided over the resources, and also that it is additional contribution to the resources now because they have a sibling, they have a companion, and compared with any other kindred relations, the siblings, they enjoy the longest time in life. You do not have such a long time with your parents. You don't even have such long shared time with even your children. But because they move in parallel in life, so that's something very important. And another worry is that I think which is justifiable, because for many of the firstborns who are already 20 years old, And suddenly, if they have a small baby that coming down who call him elder brother, or elder sister, that's something that's really uneasy.
So how important is the sibling love or brotherhood? How important is it to really hold a family together?
Well, it definitely going to enhance the family gravity. I think one thing that people will soon notice, that will create another bondage to really have the family intact, because the divorce rate is already getting very high, and to have another child is really a bond between parents per se, and also a bond with the extended family, with the elder parents. So that's a stabilizer in the society. So that's one very important thing. And the other is that another benefit is that siblings, when they learn the skills in a playroom, fighting with each other, they will go to the playground, and then they will go to the society so that they can have more skills. It's just like cats, when they learn all the skills, fighting with each other, they are better at, catching a mouse. And yes, they may rival, but I think the care of love is human. And of course, the parents will intervene, if they are there to kill each other, but that's not really a very popular case.
And how does this traditional value of brotherhood, of sibling love, really fit into the bigger picture in the society? How important is it for social development as a whole?
I agree with Professor Liu that it's the skills they learned in a playground that they will bring into the society. And actually, the brotherhood or a bigger family, shared responsibilities as well as the obligations are part of Chinese traditional culture. So I feel very positive that with the new policy, with the second child policy or even more children policy, that this traditional value will be kept and will be maybe enlarged in the social development in the long run.
But in the long term, when the government was aiming to cope with this new reality of the aging population and aging workforce, what could the second child do in the long run to promote the healthy development of the Chinese economy?
It's first thing first, the baby products will be booming in the next a couple of years.
Babies mean good business.
Yeah, good business. And then after that, followed by the education industry as well as other industries to be encouraged by this second child policy. So it will, because at the end of the day, it's not a robot or internet who's doing the consumption. It's the people, it's the human being who's doing the consumption, and it's the consumption that China needs to make the second economic boom or the transfer towards a healthy and longer term economic development. So the consumption, the government or the nation really needs the new population, the growing population, to contribute to the economic development, not from the workforce perspective, but also from the consumer perspective.
But
let me interject. In 1979, when we introduced the birth control policy for the one child, I still remember what Deng Xiaoping said. We will not let the population growth to devour the fruit of economic growth. But now we see the reality. Commodity price is cheap everywhere, and a small number of people can grow enough food for the rest of the people. So the worry, over the limitation of growth is groundless. So I had a debate with people from the Roman Club, because when they produced a book on the limitation of growth, that really scared the whole world. And China took serious action to control population. But we kind of ignore that population, they are the smartest animals. They know how to correct themselves to be more adaptive to the environment, either by family size or by family quality. And number two is that, people are the most dynamic resources, and they cannot really kill each other simply because they are more creative. They found a way to manage, they found a way to distribute. So therefore, that really gives a huge hint for reflection on the democratic policy. But of course, when we look ahead, so right now the aging population is already 14%, and we're going to see it's almost going to 20% by 37. So this is really an ailing structure of the demographic structure, and now it is even more crucial for China to balance, at least to minimize the imbalance, because we are still a developing country. If you compare with Japan and Germany, this is really more scary for China if we continue this one.
But we have to wait for a few decades, couple of decades, for this generation of newborn babies to really be old enough to join the workforce. So should there be a gap, a vacuum period between now and then?
Yes, replenishment requires time. So, but I think that's right. I really pay salute to this government. They realize the problem. They know that the one-child policy was overdosed to control the population growth, and it's never too late to correct it. Yes. So I think once we realize that, given the rising shortage of labor force, given more of the national treatment among the Chinese people, because we really took advantage of the hukou system. We have more of the rural population as demographics, but rather than the number of people, but it's based on the sort of a caste system, in China. So this should not be there. So we need a quality growth, and we need to invest. It's like growing trees. You do not need to harvest fruit for next year, but it's a sure way to do it. So why don't you do it now?
So it's worth the waiting. What are your
her
views on the future of the second child policy?
I really share Professor Liu's confidence in terms of that human beings are smart enough, and Chinese people are maybe even smarter, because before you become the workforce, just like I said, the value chain, you become the consumers first, right? And that part can also contribute to the economic development. So in the long run, I also believe that the government will need to put more measures into actions to encourage this kind of speed can be accelerated. The process can be accelerated, so the cycle may not need to wait a few decades, but maybe in 1 or 2 decades.
Yeah, if you face more children, actually you have a better sense of responsibility, and you're more motivated to work.
Yeah.
So that immediately can spur the existing workforce to work harder and work smarter. So this is an immediate contribution, because you have more responsibility.
Raising a child could be a long-term investment for both the family and the government. Thank you so much.
And a healthier portfolio.
Healthy and sustainable. All right, thank you so much for your insight on this. We really appreciate it. And now with that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wang Mengmang in Beijing. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.